Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 1021. Rejected Existence. Northern materialized behind Ruffsberg, driving through his space a razor-sharp lightning-fast punch. The space naturally halted his hand, but the barrier bent. Northern's sword was already slicing down from another angle. Ruffsberg's expression darkened as he realized he had wasted precious time on a decoy. He tried to move, but it was too late. The sword plunged toward his neck, but it never struck. Northern was hurling a punch straight toward his side, using it as a feint while concealing his sword hand. However, he stopped mid-motion and dissolved into fragments of light. Ruffsberg's frown deepened. The fact that Northern was adapting to his rewind remained as intensely baffling as ever. Consciousness, in theory, could not perceive the flow of time. Time was a great river ever surging forward, and the mind was but a single drop carried along its current. A drop wasn't meant to detect the river's movement, it was simply part of the flow. After all, when does the river flow forward and yet the waters backward? Northern's increasing awareness of time's reversal defied that truth. It was more than an anomaly, it was a threat. Not just to Ruffsberg's dominion, but perhaps to the very structure of causality itself. Ruffsberg despised what he was witnessing. Of course he was proud of Northern, and even though Northern was hellbent on killing him, he wasn't considering killing the boy. This was after all what little proof remained that he wasn't wrong, that he wasn't completely insane, that maybe drastic methods were what was needed to yield groundbreaking results. Yes, to Ruffsberg, Northern was groundbreaking, but I still need to put him in his place. He sighed. More pages in the tome within his hands flew open to a certain point and stopped. Northern now stood distant from Ruffsberg, staring with a subtle frown as he gripped his sword. Ruffsberg held his head high, regarding Northern with a calm, indifferent expression. His voice emerged in a soft, chilling crawl. "Let's teach you a little lesson, shall we?" Northern suddenly felt a dire premonition. His spatial awareness piqued, every sense of perception incredibly heightened. Something suddenly charged the air, and because his body could relate to the environment so intimately, he was acutely conscious of what was unfolding. He tensed his muscles and gripped the illusion hefter even more tightly, slowly narrowing his eyes to slits. The air around Ruffsberg seemed to shimmer golden specks like dust gathering around his lower body. The tome floated before his torso as he moved his hand and extended it forward. Throne of Nocturne, Monarch's Descent. The entire ground seemed to tremble. Not just the ground, in fact, but the very air itself, and the concept of reality seemed to violently shake for a brief second. Then the entire battlefield darkened, the sky instantly shrouded with darkness before a terrifying thunderclap roared through the black clouds. Northern frowned, waiting his sword hand at the ready, and his eyes sternly locked on his opponent. From behind Ruffsberg, a massive throne of molten gold and darkness formed. The entire battlefield became submerged in a strange and hostile atmosphere. Northern felt suddenly rejected by the space, though not so much that he would be seized and thrown out. It was as if the very concept of his being here was being subdued by the laws of this domain. A cold, wicked smile gently stained Ruffsberg's lips. "You feel it, don't you?" He began to walk closer, moving with the throne of molten gold behind him. "A subtle suppression of your existence." He stopped a few meters before Northern. "Isn't it astonishing, spell art that is? Isn't it astonishing that an age discovered a way to manipulate the essence of language words to carve out authority and expression?" Northern glared at him while simultaneously enduring the pressure that felt like he shouldn't exist. His mind almost refused to engage in any conversation. He was tempted to assert his existence against the strange force, to resist it with the sheer power of his will. However, Northern's premonition warned that would be wrong. He wasn't sure what Ruffsberg had done to the space, but he suspected it wasn't a weave of will. In fact, will didn't seem to be any integral part of it. "Spell arts, huh? I've been curious about it too." Ruffsberg grinned, baring his teeth. Then he waved his hand. The ground erupted toward Northern. "Love the story? Show your support on M9 Vlemper." Golden liquid surged forth with vicious speed, solidifying into cold javelin spears. Northern gritted his teeth and gripped his sword tightly, straining to move. However, the force was even more terrible than had imagined. Where he commanded his body to move, the force commanded his body not to move. He tried to shift his legs, but they were frozen in place. Veins bulged on his forehead, his face reddened as he struggled to move that single leg but achieved no breakthrough. He had never felt so powerful in his entire life, and yet had never felt so powerless. He felt so powerful because he was applying all the strength in his body to move just one leg. He was trying to move one leg with the power that could shove a mountain aside. Blood began to drip from his ear as he continued to fight against the force. His eyes reddened and soon he was bleeding from his eyes and nose. And yet movement was not a concept available to him. As a matter of fact, his existence was frozen in perpetual contemplation by the space. Movement was not a luxury afforded to him, and the more he tried to break that rule, the more the reality of this domain frowned upon him. Golden javelins streaked down upon him. One pierced his shoulder, another drove into the center of his chest, the third stabbed through his right thigh. Your armor has been destroyed. Northern watched with a bleak expression as the fragments of his best buddy vanished into shards of black light and dissolved into the air. Ruffsberg regarded him with a cold, stoic look in his eyes. It was a look of pure condescension. Chapter 1022. Momentum King. His surroundings still crushed him with unbearable force. There was nothing he could do to escape the horrific situation. Northern fell silent for a moment. His teeth clenched tight as he fought to resist. He thought for a bit. Maybe the problem was that he was trying too hard. But when he tried to not try, he almost felt himself being hurled out of existence. His body was nearly vanishing, which immediately made him hold on again. Whatever spell Ruffsberg had cast, it was devastating. Pain lanced through every part of his body as more molten gold solidified and struck him with brutal speed. His body trembled but did not fall. Through tooth and nail he kept himself standing. Despite this, a pool of his blood was forming on the ground. Long golden javelins buried into his body at different angles, forming the monolith of a martyred hero. His mind worked overtime to discover a solution to his situation. Northern had one clone on standby that was not around here. He could bring the clone in, but it would only be submerged into the same circumstances. I guess this is the only way. Northern exhaled slowly. The entire air around him shifted. The temperature slowly rose and his eyes burned with a crimson color. Suddenly the air seemed to warp and large shafts of the javelins were completely crushed by some force. The air around Northern's entire body was coated, as if air was wearing air and wrapping itself around his entire body. He moved his hand and slowly his hand was moving. He began to pull himself out of the javelins until his body was out completely. He stood and staggered, a little blood dripping from literal holes embedded in his body. Any other person would have died from this. But Northern's body was slowly closing. This was probably the passive effect of chaos that he really had no control over, no matter how much he said he wanted to stop the usage of chaos and void. But because of it, his body was soon closed back, although he had to endure terrible pain himself. Ruffsberg frowned and looked at Northern. How is he standing? He extended his hand again. One of Northern's legs went down, but his knee did not touch the ground before he was already standing with a fierce, defiant light in his eyes. He glared at Ruffsberg and grinned. Then he vanished. Northern did not disappear. Despite having changed his name to Burning Storm and now wrapping his entire body in a layer of momentum that actively resisted the force of the domain on his behalf, he was still greatly affected. But now, because he didn't have to actively resist the force, he had the momentum doing that for him, he could focus on other things. Northern streaked forward and clashed with Ruffsberg before he could draw another spell out of the book. A wide shockwave exploded and rolled forward, shrouding the domain in a dust of smoke. As the smoke was slowly being cleared, Northern was revealed with his hand being blocked by a round golden medal. Ruffsberg was behind the medal, frowning. Northern withdrew his hand and raised it again. The air coated around his hand seemed to condense even more, and he brought it down again without delay. Ruffsberg was still looking with a dark grimace, very confident that his golden shield was going to block it off. However, Northern's hand cut through. Ruffsberg's eyes widened as he saw this. Immediately tens of golden plate layers appeared right beneath this one in order to stop Northern's hand, but they were useless. His hand cleanly sliced through them all, grasping the middle of his eyes and on his nose. The ground behind him split into two in an instant. Even the air parted, the darkened veil of darkness above was also cleaved all the way. Northern glared at him indifferently, his tone flat and detached. The miss was intentional. Next time I want miss. Ruffsberg was silent. His face wrinkled and he lashed his hand forward. From his shadows golden tendrils shot into the air. However, Northern was fast. His hand moved and they were sliced apart. Wherever the golden tendrils were shooting from his hand was flying away from that direction, and the tendrils were exploding and shattering from the impact. The sound reverberated across the realm as Northern battered his attack, his one hand becoming a blur as he flew here and there, bashing and destroying the tendrils that shot at him with blistering speed. The sky darkened and rumbled and began to hurl dark javelins. However, Northern simply swatted them away. His movements looked easy, but there was immense work going into each movement. First, his entire body was coated with momentum. Second, Northern was a lord over momentum at this moment. Momentum equals force times acceleration. However, Burning Storm's ability denies the very reality of that concept, making it possible to generate momentum without force and acceleration. reversing the entire equation and making momentum able to create force and acceleration. To report errors, please visit the original post on Vlemper. When he used Speed Eclipse, each of Northern's attacks did not need a speed buildup. It was all according to the amount of essence he applied. His essence had gotten to a lower body level, by the way. Northern was well aware that he had to be very mindful of his essence use, considering that there was only one clone he had left in Limitless Void. Regardless, he was generous with his essence, as mindful as he was too. The tome floating before Ruffsberg flipped open with speed and stopped somewhere. Immediately Northern's gaze darkened. Before whatever was coming could emerge, he flew into the air, flying away from Ruffsberg with a dark frown. The dark clouds rumbled and something crushed into him the moment he fled toward the sky. The dark veil generated a solidified dark hand that crushed him to the ground, causing the entire realm to tremble tremendously. Northern was beneath the palms of the enormous hand, slapped to the ground like a mosquito. Chapter 1023. There are laws and there is me. The colossal hand remained still for a moment, pressing grinding sealing Northern into the broken land beneath. The ground fractured in spiraling patterns as if struggling to hold the weight of the suppression. Dust and debris floated upward, reverse falling in slow motion due to the domain's warped pressure. Ruffsberg stood a short distance away, waiting. Then the hand twitched. A sharp pulse of crimson light flared through the cracks, like veins bursting open in stone. One beat, two. The third came with a deafening crack. The massive hand convulsed. A low hum echoed through the sky. Then the dark hand exploded from within. Fragments of condensed shadow spiraled outward in controlled chaos. And there he stood, hunched, slightly, steam rising from his bare shoulders. One side of his body was scorched, raw bones visible where skin had torn, and even then it was slowly healing. Threads of chaos knitted tissue like a tailor working madly under moonlight. Northern's eyes lifted. The crimson in them now carried streaks of silver. His gaze locked onto Ruffsberg with the calm finality of a blade mid-swing. Ruffsberg muttered something inaudible and pointed forward. The tome beside him burst into flame, not from heat but from incantation overload. Golden scripts swam across the sky like serpents, forming circles upon circles, spinning in elegant concentric patterns. A storm of golden monoliths surged into existence behind Ruffsberg, each the height of towers etched with holy sigils vibrating with divine resonance. Each of them was a binding, a seal, punishment. I sentence you, Ruffsberg's voice thundered with divine weight, to obliteration under the laws of the founders. They fell. The monoliths descended like judgment itself, golden mountains carved from divine wrath, each one trailing streams of molten scripture. The air itself seemed to bow under their weight, reality bending at the edges where the holy seals touched the world. Northern didn't move. The first monolith struck where he stood, driving deep into the fractured earth with a sound like the world's spine breaking. The second followed, then the third, each impact sending shockwaves that turned stone to powder and powder to nothing. Dust clouds billowed upward, obscuring everything in a golden haze thick with divine energy. The very atoms seemed to sing hymns of destruction. Ruffsberg lowered his arm, breathing heavily. The divine scripts still swirled around him, but slower now, their light dimming as he whispered, "It is finished." The words carried the weight of absolute conviction. But the dust was moving wrong. Not settling downward as it should, but spiraling, drawn toward something at the crater's center. The golden haze began to darken, threads of flame weaving through it like infection through blood. A laugh echoed from the depths, low, rasping, utterly without humor. That one's new. The founders? Are they from the age where spell art originated? And what exactly is finished? If that was the best of your ability, Ruffsberg, we are a long, long way from finished. Northern flew. Ruffsberg gritted his teeth. He was not gonna lie, this was beginning to get tiring. How was the bastard emerging and scathed through every attack thrown at him? He clicked his tongue irritably and moved his hand to wipe his forehead. However, Ruffsberg stopped mid-motion. He moved one finger and touched his forehead, then brought it to his face. "Im sweating?" Northern flew down and collided with him, causing shockwaves to fly outward with clouds of scattered debris. Ruffsberg was gripping Northern by the neck when the clouds cleared. He drew his other hand back and unleashed a devastating punch, crushing Northern's face once. The first blow generated a shockwave and blood exploded from Northern's face. But Northern was grinning. Ruffsberg clenched his hand even tighter and threw another punch into his face. The fist kept flying and Ruffsberg kept reshaping Northern's face with his knuckles, blood arcing and spraying into the air. However, Northern did not stop grinning. The sound of the punches soared through the air like terrifying thunderclaps. At some point, Northern's face was dismantled and unrecognizable. Blood had pooled and veiled his entire visage. However, his mouth was wide open, grinning, blood dripping on and between his teeth. He was like a macabre and vile demon existing to relish in the splendor of pain and bloodshed. For a moment, as Ruffsberg prepared to throw another punch, he hesitated. And that right there seemed to be what Northern was waiting for. Solute heat. The air around them didn't just heat up, it became heat. Pure, unfiltered thermal energy that existed beyond the concept of temperature itself. The very molecules began to scream as they were forced beyond their breaking points. Ruffsberg's eyes widened. His divine essence, his carefully constructed defenses, his spatial protections. All of it began to buckle under the assault of infinite thermal energy. The golden scripts that had been circling him started to melt midair, their divine inscriptions bleeding like golden tears. Impossible! He began, but even his voice was being consumed by the heat. Northern's grin widened, blood still streaming down his face, but now it was evaporating before it could fall. His wounds were cauterizing instantly, then tearing open again from the sheer intensity of his own power, creating a grotesque cycle of destruction and regeneration. The ground beneath them didn't melt, it sublimated directly into plasma. The air itself caught fire, not from combustion but from the sheer presence of thermal energy so intense that reality itself began to unravel at the quantum level. Ruffsberg felt it then, true fear. Not the tactical concern of a difficult opponent, but the primal terror of facing something that existed beyond the natural order. His divine nature, his very existence as a being of higher power, all of it meant nothing when faced with the fundamental force of infinite energy. Parto facery shosted be my virtual library. Empire, MV and Lemp and YR. He released Northern's neck and staggered backward, his hands already beginning to blister despite all his protections. Golden holy sigils appeared across his skin, only to burn away not from external heat, but from the impossibility of containing such power within the same space. Ruffsberg's voice cracked. What is this? What are you? Northern's laugh was a sound like solar flares given voice. Ruffsberg, there are laws. And there is me. He took a step forward, each footfall leaving molten glass in his wake. I am become heat. Infinite. Eternal. Absolute. The very domain around them began to collapse. Not from structural damage, but because the space itself could no longer contain the contradiction of infinite thermal energy existing within finite boundaries. Reality bent, twisted, and started to tear at the seams. Ruffsberg raised his hands, golden light flaring around him, as he desperately tried to invoke another binding. But his tome was already ash, his scripts were vaporizing at a terrible rate. Divine sanctuary. He began to chant, but the words turned to steam before they could take effect. Northern was walking toward him now, unhurried, inevitable. Each step caused supernovas of heat to bloom around his feet. The air rippled with thermal distortion so intense that space itself was bending. Tell me, Ruffsberg, Northern said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the fundamental breakdown of reality. Whoever created laws, did they ever consider what would happen when someone chose to embody the very forces those laws were meant to contain? The distance between them closed. 5 feet. 4. 3. Ruffsberg's entire body was beginning to break down at the molecular level. His perfect eternal features were starting to blur and distort as the proteins in his body approached their thermal breaking point. I am eternal. He gasped, pouring every ounce of his divine essence into maintaining his form. I cannot die. Northern stopped just outside arm's reach. His crimson and silver eyes locked onto Ruffsberg's with the calm finality of entropy itself. He said softly, eternity is just another word for a very long time. And time burns. He reached out with one hand, palm open, fingers spread. The gesture was almost gentle. The effect would not be. Chapter 1024. Rest. Ruffsberg's eyes widened. He was in a state where he was barely clinging to life. Staying alive was more grueling than dying. If Northern unleashed his next attack, what would happen? This left him with two choices. He either had to truly take on Northern, which he believed would definitely kill the poor juvenile, or his test was done, and it was time for him to retreat. As pitiful as that sounded, Ruffsberg saw no shame in it. Northern, the guy had managed to give him a shock no one in the world had. No one in this world had proven capable of destroying him. However, if Northern was given the chance, he definitely would. And he was only a sage. What happens if he becomes a paragon? Ruffsberg felt his spine go cold as he thought about it. I can't be enemies with him. Ruffsberg felt a crushing wave of fear about how bleak his future might be if he continued to clash with Northern from time to time. In this fight alone, Northern had grown leaps and bounds and would continue to grow more each time they fought until he was capable of defeating him at his peak. Ruffsberg feared that. And his fear, in fact, was immense. As the vapor began to release searing smoke, Ruffsberg began to feel the impending destruction that was going to rip his body apart. The cells of his body were already disintegrating at an alarming rate, and he had to maintain constant time reversal to stop it from totally killing him. Even while he stood, he was already beginning to look younger than he had a couple of minutes ago. It was getting dangerous by the second, and he knew it. I have to flee, he admitted to himself shamelessly. A dark frown fell on his face, and while everything was vaporizing, the very air was burning without flames. Ruffsberg vanished. Just like that, nothing grand, nothing dramatic. He simply ceased to exist in this space. The domain he had conjured dissolved faster, already being torn down by absolute heat. Northern frowned ferociously and dropped his hand, his eyes scanning the surroundings for a moment. No matter how he thought about it, Ruffsburg was gone. The force that was constantly trying to throw him out of the space was also gone. His body felt relieved as he removed the coating of momentum. He felt free, like the weight of the world had been lifted from him. And a restraint on his soul was also released, something he had no idea Ruffsburg had even put there. But that explained why his summons hadn't been able to come out of the limitless void. The bastard had constructed a barricade between his soul and the space of reality. Northern staggered forward but plunged his sword into the ground and leaned on it. He was silent for a while, then he gritted his teeth and shouted at the peak of his voice. "You bastard! How dare you run away? You fool! Come back and let me whip your mother's ass!" He exhaled and panted as he stopped, looking toward the clouds as they cleared and the rays of the day star hidden within began to penetrate through. Then the disappearing dark clouds began to form runic words. Northern belatedly caught it and frowned, then he read internally. "I am not your enemy." His frown grew even darker. "Why don't you come down here so we can talk about that man-to-man, huh?" However, there was no response. Ruffsburg was gone. Long gone. Northern stood alone in the scarred battlefield. The day star was already retreating to the horizon, which was proof enough that Northern had been in battle with Ruffsburg for almost all day. Besides that, from the day before into the night he had fought Dante and a Leviathan. Even before that he had to cut off a Leviathan's hand and fought in the tournament. In between that he had to destroy some behemoths, defeat a paragon of Dante's, and defeat the Academy backstabbers on the flying ship as well. Now that he wasn't doing anything, the fatigue was seeping into his soul. Now that he wasn't forcing his legs to move, they were aching so badly that his legs were trembling. His hands had stayed clenched so much that he could not unfold them. And his internal body was screaming. It was a tangled mess of organs and bones. As chaos slowly fixed it up, Northern was trapped in a vicious cycle of pain. But he was so used to it that his facial expression didn't give any of that away. The pain it took when chaos was mending his body would naturally kill any other person. The pain alone was enough to drive their brain mad. People lose their sanity from torture after all. But Northern over time had endured such pain that now it made no difference to him anymore. As he wanted to move, his vision suddenly went dim. He tried to open his eyes to keep them open, but it suddenly felt like a Herculean task. One he was too weak for. As he took a step forward, his consciousness wavered and succumbed to the tempting embrace of rest. Slowly his body went down. But a black wing fluttered, black feathers falling from it. She stood gently in front of Northern, letting his jaw fall on her shoulders. Then she patted his back with a tense smile, one that held 1,000 complicated emotions. Her face swung sideways as she began to hear footsteps. Her expression was wary at first, almost like a cat with its hackles rising, but she did the comms the next minute. And smiled as she first saw Helena. Helena's eyes widened as she got within close distance. "Oh, my dead stars. He thought I was hallucinating. It really is you, Raven." Raven's smile widened a bit as she tilted her head. "You've grown quite strong, Helena." She threw her face to the side and squeezed her expression for a bit. "Tell that to Ruffsburg, who beat the shit out of me without even trying." She was silent for a moment, then she exhaled and looked at Northern, who was slumped against Raven's shoulder. She looked around, no sign of Ruffsburg. "He fled?" Raven lingered, then nodded. Helena released a scoff and shifted her weight to rest on one leg with her hands resting on her waist. "Of course he fled. Even Ruffsburg at the end of the day was subjected to the might of Northern's existence. If you want to say someone has grown stronger, you should point to him. A/N. Amidst all the struggles recently, this volume has come to an end. The next volume will be a lot of battle, and I'd like us to be integrated into it. I apologize for how unsteady update stability has been. I just need to get my shit together. But I promise to end this book. It's not gonna stop. So do not stop supporting. If anything, I need that support now. I hate to admit it, but I need the comments to cheer me up. I need the power stones and golden tickets to make me realize that people still care about my book, still care about Northern's story. I need the gifts to remind me that a lot of people are giving their all into this, so I must respond with great chapters, a lot of great chapters and peak contents. Thank you. Chapter 1025, Web of Ploys. After Helena, Annette, and Vita arrived as well. They expressed equal shock to suddenly see Raven cradling Northern. But they had little time to linger and catch up. They had to move, and move fast. Northern had managed to explain to Annette to a reasonable extent how the whole of Central Plains was in danger, and Annette herself connected that to what she had been investigating. Apparently Raven was also able to confirm some unlikely event unfolding in the Stelia. And she believed the disappearance of Terrence was connected to all of it. The descent of Cryos and the disappearance of Terrence, they were deeply intertwined. Right there in the center of the ravaged landscape where the battle between Northern and Ruffsburg had scarred the earth, they sat and planned. Annette shared what she knew. She had been investigating this matter the longest. After all, she was the one most affected by it. Annette used to be a very renowned drifter. Unlike most in her family, though she wasn't a skilled forger, so many in her family didn't value her as much. But her control over fire was astonishing, so it was impossible to really dismiss her. She was cared for and respected nonetheless as a member of the family. The Ishar family was a renowned family that wielded fire in their souls. They were one of the very first families that discovered another branch of soul essence called flame essence, and were stronger than any other. They were the most formidable forgers not just in Central Plains but arguably in the entirety of Trail. Of course, they were also one of the vassal families of the Riemgard Empire and were bound by duty to forge weapons only for the empire. Of course, that alone was more than enough for them to amass riches. However, it also kept them shackled within the confines of the empire. Annette was not a forger, she was a fighter, and as she grew up the need to enter more rifts intensified and she made a difficult decision that her family opposed. It was forbidden for her to leave the empire. It was forbidden for any member of the Ishar family to leave the confines of the Riemgard Empire whether they were forgers or not. It was a rule to protect the secret art of forging that the family owned. Annette didn't know the art and definitely wouldn't leak it, but no one paid any attention to that. Rules were rules, and because of that rule she was barred from going to the outside world. Her growth was getting stunted. That was when she met Ruffsberg and Gilbert and also Felix. He was merely a brief moment in her story and had been a student of the academy in his last year. Ruffsberg's aide as a matter of fact. Felix was an extremely intelligent non-combat drifter. He had a utility-type talent and was quite the fragile boy. But he was a repository of knowledge. He had the ability to create books and write information there. So he usually followed Ruffsberg as a scribe documenting a lot of things. This exposed him to an inevitable truth about everything. These truths began to make Felix question everything. With Ruffsberg and Gilbert's help, Annette was able to leave Riemgard and became a drifter. Her growth was astonishing and her relationship with Gilbert and Felix deepened as they challenged rifts together. Felix was always there to note things about the monsters and resources and give reports back to Ruffsberg while she and others were always protecting him. But there was something strange. The rifts Ruffsberg usually sent them to were usually specific and dangerous. But Annette never found out until she entered a Tier 4 rift. She expected the same level of difficulty as the one she had once challenged on Ruffsberg's orders. However, it was easy. So easy that she believed only she could have cleared it. Out of curiosity, she began to venture into rifts without Ruffsberg's knowledge, and soon discovered that a lot of rifts that emerge in the world are not as frightening as the ones Ruffsberg would send them to. Why? This question burned in her mind, no matter how much she tried to suppress it. Eventually she gave in and spoke to Felix about her confusion and questions. This question of hers made her realize that Felix had been in a state of perpetual doubt for a long time. In fact, he had gone far deeper in questioning Ruffsberg's actions than she had. Their questions and investigations grew more dangerous. Eventually they were unable to keep hiding it. Things became suspicious. This ultimately led to Ruffsberg sending them to a rift that they were unable to protect Felix in. It led to his death and Annette's trauma about rifts. She stopped challenging rifts and her growth as master was halted. Eventually this led her to the public citadel under Gilbert's jurisdiction and where she also met Northern. Taking a short journey down that memory lane was harrowing for her. Helena exhaled. So you're saying this entire island, the academy itself, could have been just a plot to bring back some Chaos Prince? Annette interjected. Not just the Chaos Prince. I believe there are interwoven schemes in the creation of this island from Milwa to Professor Heimberger. Everything is interconnected somehow but so strangely woven together, not intentionally of course. Raven was silent. Annette had explained a lot of things to them and it had all sounded like she just dropped a mind bomb on them all. It was harrowing first and foremost that an entire island was constructed to hide the existence of a corpse that should not exist. Milwa, according to Annette, would have been the one who most likely found the macabre corpse and also discovered the hack to Chaos Essence. She brushed her hand through her hair. Rifts have told us about tyrants and origins, and to an extent we are knowledgeable that they exist beyond our world. How did a tyrant die on trail and not a single document of history speaks about it? Lady Raven is right. If it was in a rift it would be understandable. But it was not. Something is wrong, we are all missing something here. Vita added. Helena sighed. As right as we all are, that is not the way forward. Right now we know for certain that Milwa is not dead. Professor Heimberger is trying to bring back a tyrant and Kahl is trying to bring back an origin, all of which are using each other without each other realizing. She paused for a moment and asked, now how do we disrupt all of it? Chapter 1026. A Sword King Without a Sword. Raven was lost in thought when she suddenly flinched and frowned. Helena and Annette seemed to be discussing something else. Vita stood behind them. None of them sensed anything until Raven suddenly flinched. Then they turned to the left and there he was. A man with long white hair and flowing garments that blended the fashion of some strange unknown era with Eastern continental style. He stood casually, one hand tucked inside his robes. He moved his hand to scratch his cheek briefly before waving at them. "Hello." Raven grimaced darkly, slowly unclenching her fists. All of them were on guard, Helena, Annette, and Vita. The strange aura radiating from the man's presence wouldn't let them relax. His entire composure left no openings. His stance was casual, yet all of them couldn't help but feel trapped in a web of blades where one wrong move could cost their lives. Byron smiled at them first, then slowly shifted his gaze toward Raven, who knelt on the ground beside Northern. Raven stared back, showing no fear in her eyes. In fact, her crimson eyes burned dangerously. But her body language betrayed complete hesitation. Byron kept smiling. He inhaled slowly and exhaled, then smiled even wider. "The very reason I exist is to destroy you." Raven's frown deepened. "Who are you? Why would you want to destroy me?" Byron unleashed a mad grin. "I am Byron, and he created me to destroy you." Raven glanced back at Northern, who was lost in the deep abyss of rest. She turned back to Byron. "I understand why Northern would want to destroy me, but creating you, it's impossible. Creation is impossible for a mortal." Byron chuckled darkly. "Oh, you child. You don't even know him at all. If I were to name him a king, I'd call him the king of impossibilities. He has just one job, and it's to do the impossible. Did you not just witness it yourself?" Raven fell silent. She looked at Northern and looked down. It was almost difficult to accept the reality the man was speaking about Northern, yet, just as he said, she had witnessed Northern fight at a level that left her mouth agape. His speed, his strikes, the way he defied the very laws of reality. Those were not things mortals should be able to do. Why was Northern able to do them? He had grown stronger, certainly. But just how much stronger had he become? Raven had a broad mind. She saw great potential in people and could usually gauge each person's capability to reach that potential. Whether it was the potential for greatness or the potential for wretchedness, it was always a choice. For those she loved and favored, she always ensured they reached their potential for greatness, even if she had to be the villain in their story. It was the only thing that fulfilled her. She had lived a cruel life until this moment. No amount of hatred could move her. She had been killed more times than she could count by her own siblings simply because she existed, and had to survive simply to die again, yet her own father never spared her a glance. There was no suffering, no hatred that she hadn't endured before the age of 10. So it was easy for her to be the villain in people's stories. She didn't mind as long as they lived up to their potential. That was her comfort. However, she wouldn't lie that she always envisioned a peak. And no one had managed to surprise her by breaking through that peak. However, thinking back on the little she had seen of Northern's power made her realize Northern might be more than she had thought. Of course, she didn't even know that this was merely a fraction of Northern's power. Before this battle, the poor guy had been terribly spent. No drifter would have been able to fight under the conditions Northern fought and still win. No one would have been able to endure what he endured and still live. There was no one, not any of them, standing here today and beyond. And they knew. At least Helena knew, Annette knew, Vita knew. None of them expected that Northern would still be able to fight Ruffsburg after having to deal with that abominable Leviathan. But he rose to the occasion without being asked. Northern was a hero. A true one. Of course he would puke at the word. But they knew. He was the savior the world needed. And maybe Raven, realizing that he was the only person who could help her, was also her way of admitting to a shred of that truth. Of course, when it came to Raven, she still had 1,000 more shocks and surprises to endure before fully realizing the extent of how much Northern had grown. Byron exhaled, cutting Raven from her reverie. "So, the way this is supposed to go is I draw my sword and cut you down in one strike." Raven stared back with a guarded expression. She looked ready to fight, or to be fair, to defend her life. "However, I don't have a sword." Byron looked down and clicked his teeth in regret. "Some bastard took mine and somehow managed to use it against me. Crazy, I know, and as a sword king, that was very careless of me. Say, would you be willing to lend me a sword to slay you?" Raven looked at him warily, her gaze calm despite being heavily vigilant. "I don't have a spare." Byron exhaled. "That settles it then. I'm just gonna have to tell my master when he wakes up that I tried to kill you, but I had no sword in my hands. I'll wait for him to wake up and forge me a sword or something." Byron chuckled lightly. "Do you know he recently learned how to forge, and oh good stars, he's already so good at it. He's gonna forge an entire forgery even." Raven frowned, confused. "How does one forge a forgery?" Byron shrugged. "How would I know? I'm not much of a blacksmith. In fact, I hate to touch charred and dirty things." He looked over to the rest. "Well, as it turns out like this, would it be okay if I take charge in my master's stead? I am his second in command after all." All of them looked at each other, unable to respond to him. Funnily, Byron didn't even need to ask. The air was already dominated by him. And if he was willing to help them anyway without having to hold a sword, his presence alone had spoken for his capability. He stepped forward and bent down, then he touched Northern. Immediately the body began to disappear. Before any of them could speak, Byron's commanding and authoritative voice broke forth. Fear not. He's merely where he loves to be. He looked at the rest of them. Now, this is what we will do. Chapter 10:27, War Speech. This is what we know. Kahl is inciting war across the entire continent. And with recent events, I'd say he's already succeeded. Every nation in the Central Plains will react to the devastation that swept through Fugal. Not just that, different militaries led by different inexperienced paragons are striking different nations with no justifiable objective. And it makes perfect sense why they do that. He just needed enough reason to ignite the war. Once it started, reason vanished and everyone is slowly being consumed by madness. Byron paused, scanning the devastated land. This is the very sign that all is unfolding according to his plan, the destruction and the fact that we're about to take action too. Annette looked at the Sword King strangely. Before she could speak though, Byron continued, his gaze fixed directly on her. No, I'm not saying we should do nothing. What I'm trying to make you all realize is that what you're about to do cannot stop what has already been set in motion. Whatever they want to tear down is already crumbling. They've cooked it and it's done. Kahl has won. Annette frowned darkly, as did Helena and Vita. Only Raven maintained an indifferent expression and asked, "So, what do we do?" Byron looked to his side where she was standing. "We fight." Raven furrowed her brows. "Fight? What?" Byron shrugged. "Whatever it is that's coming. We fight it. If what we suspect it to be is really what it is, that's impossible. Paragons cannot even stand before an origin. They are the first voice of a concept and beings meant not to belong to this world. Mere mortals cannot fight origins." Byron looked at Raven silently, then at the rest of them. Then he smiled. However, his smile seemed to mock them. Defeated already without fighting. Hiya. What a disappointment. Annette scowled. "You don't know. You didn't see what we saw. If that thing had descended that day, we would have no world right now." She looked at the others. "I think we should find a way to reseal him." Byron's calm voice cut through. "And for how long before they unseal him again? Are you trying to trap yourself in a vicious cycle? What if your generation passes and the generation that comes is unable to contain it? Then it finally breaks free. Not to mention the fact that your enemy behind the seal will only keep growing smarter. You're giving him more time to fester and devour the world anyway." Annette lowered her gaze and muttered, I never really saw it that way." Byron looked at all of them directly. "Nobody sees it that way. But would any of you be dealing with this if you had just handled it at the time, even if it came at a great cost?" They were all silent. Byron's words were cutting deep. "What you all simply did was procrastinate. And it's a little disappointing that it's what you're all resorting to again." The words hung heavily in the air before Raven's voice sliced through like a frost blade. "But fighting an origin is..." Byron raised his index finger. "It is one origin. Just one." He pointed at them. "All of you cannot take down. Just one origin?" Something was wrong with the question. Of course they all couldn't take care of one origin, that was normal. They all didn't know how strong origins were supposed to be. But those creatures, from the little that drifters have studied of them, did things like moving the Daystar, resting on the moon for fresh air, drinking an ocean dry. Really bizarre things in diverse and creative manners. No mortal, no drifter in their right mind would want to fight an origin. But why did it feel so shameful? They should say no, it was the normal thing to say, but the words stuck in their throats, refusing to come out. It felt so shameful that all of them couldn't take down origins. What they didn't know was exactly why. Was it because of the eyes staring at them, or was it because for a minute they had mistaken themselves to be strong? Byron looked at them with half-closed, bored eyes. Then he exhaled. "My master is more than enough to take care of an origin. I mean, he even has a tyrant serving him after all." Their brows twitched in that instant. Byron moved his head and was distracted by the enormous airship crafted with concrete that slowly floated towards them. It settled. "We shall go back to the main city and inform the guilds as the master has said. In the meantime, do the little that you can do to save as many people as you can save. As much as the schemes of these people are concerning and you all want to make sure we're not simply falling into their laid-out trap, but I think it's too late now." Byron held out his hand and clenched it. "What we should do now is fight. But do not fight to kill. Fight to save. Fight to save the warriors from themselves. Fight to save the poor and weak civilians and folks who are caught up in this mess." He slowly removed his other hand from inside his garment. "I'm not good at war speeches, neither do I think any of you need those. However, I think you all should be very careful about staying safe. Give my master a little time to rest. He will join us soon and all this will come to an end. In the meantime, you have the full support of the entire summons of the limitless void." As he spoke, the space seemed to shimmer, and from the ground and the space behind Byron they began to emerge. Raven, Annette, Vita, and Helena paled when they saw a four-armed monster holding a staff walk out of the spatial rift. There was a knight with white cloak and golden helmet. There was a strange small creature with horizontal pupils that kept making a strange bleeding sound. There was a young man with black hair and pale face. He looked like everything in the world irritated him, and on a deeper look he bore a certain resemblance to Northern. There was a crimson statue dwarfing all of them. It seemed like its skin was liquid crimson flowing but never touching the ground. A large white wolf along with a black hunchback humanoid creature also emerged from the rift. Lastly, walking like a human was a lithe figure with sharp slitted eyes emanating white glow. Suddenly the air around felt so tight, and Annette Helena. They all couldn't help but feel so small. Chapter 1028. The Network of Information. Thalen rested both hands on the table, his hair disheveled and a dark scowl twisting his expression. In front of him Alistrin and 3 other people stood waiting. Silence stretched between them before he exhaled heavily. Helena still cannot be contacted? The one beside Alistrin, a slim freckled boy, slowly adjusted his glasses and clutched the book he was hugging. I tried to track her location with the item, but the last trace I could find was the Academy Island. Thalen's scowl deepened. There have been reports of seismic shockwaves surging through the air all the way from the Academy. The aerial transportation body passed an urgent warning that no airship should traverse the Academy route. As if that weren't enough, Fugal has been completely wiped from the surface. Everything has vanished. Alistrin, folding his arms, added. All this I suspect is linked to the military. I heard Verilania was nearly destroyed. All communication with the Nation Alliance has been severed. It's nearly impossible to determine the state of the Central Plains at this moment. Another man with slicked-back red and black gradient hair interjected. The entire continent feels isolated, warp systems are down. They claim there's interference and locations are disconnected. Everything feels discombobulated, too much of a disaster. Thalen stepped away from the table and straightened his back. He closed his eyes, massaging his forehead as he considered what to do. In that moment a light knock came at the door. Everyone in the office glanced back, and the last man, who had short wavy brown hair, went to answer it. The person at the door was a young attendant with gray hair tied in a ponytail, slightly slanted eyes, and a pale complexion. Sir, there's a strange man claiming he's from Sage Rian. She hesitated briefly. However, the unbelievable part is that he claims to be Elitis. The man's eyes narrowed. What absurd lie is that? Elitis is a network of information, not a person. He paused for a moment, then looked at the attendant. However, if he claims to be from Sage Rian, I think you should let him in. The lady bowed. Very well, Savant Treasure. I'll send him in. The man nodded and turned around. Thalen looked at him as he approached the center of the office. Treasure, what was that about? Savant Treasure gestured lightly. Some guy claiming to be Elitis. Everyone in the room frowned at the absurdity almost simultaneously and nearly said in unison. Huh? Treasure added. I know. He also claims to be from Sage Rian. The moment Thalen heard that, he bolted forward. Everyone in the room completely missed the instant he reached Treasure. All they knew was that he was gripping the savant's shoulder. From Rian. Send him in. If he's from Rian, it could really be Elitis. Savant Treasure looked at his headmaster with a cautious expression and slowly rolled his shoulder from the gentle grip. He gets like this whenever Sage Rian is mentioned. What is it about this guy? Another knock came at the door, and a young gentleman with a monocle over one eye and a neatly tailored black suit slowly walked inside. He stopped before reaching Treasure and Thalen and bowed subtly. It is an honor to meet the headmaster of the Therian Citadel, Therian Thalen. He was looking directly at Thalen. Thalen rarely showed his face, and the people who knew him as the headmaster of the Citadel were mostly within the Citadel itself. He could count on one hand those who knew. Surely some middle-aged man with prim and proper dress and refined accent wasn't supposed to know. Thalen looked at him, his purple eyes glowing faintly. Then he exhaled steadily. You are Elitis. The man replied, I am Elitis. Thalen wanted to laugh, but his expression was pale, and a forced smile slowly crept across his face. His eyes were almost trembling. It was really Elitis, a man that even the Empire would die to have under their control. It was difficult enough to reach the northern continent, but rumors claimed this guy frequented all 3 continents as if they were a street or 2 away. And it was so insane that Elitis could never be considered one person. This guy was everywhere. Somehow he knew everything while no one knew him. Thalen looked at him with narrowed eyes and raised his head slightly. If you are Elitis, then prove it to me. The proper man smiled gently. You are rather mistaken, Lord Thalen. The only one I have anything to prove to is the Void Lord. He looked straight into Thalen's eyes. However, I must tell you that in a few minutes South Drywall will be attacked. You must rally your drifters. And that attack is only a surface distraction. Thalen frowned as Elitis paused. But the gentleman continued his speech unhurried. You are very familiar with the Age of the Firsts, aren't you? The time before the world was torn apart? Thalen looked at him keenly. Yes. Elitis spoke indifferently. There are survivors from that age. Perhaps descendants. Dark elves. They are also behind this disaster. The attack on Drywall is to throw you off so they can steal the compass. Thalen frowned. A lot was being unveiled as the man spoke. He didn't even need any other confirmation that this was Elitis. But the problem was that these were high-level secrets that Thalen believed had never left the underground of the Citadel. Thalen's expression grew dark and hostile. Do you think the fact that you are Elitis would let me overlook that you're privy to information that even people here don't know? Elitis responded with the usual calmness he'd maintained since the beginning. I don't care whatever goes on in your mind. There is only one person I care about. And thanks to him I am at your disposal. Why don't you kindly Sage Thalen use me to save your citadel and your plan to find a permanent door to the underworld? This is after all the best time such a plan can come to fruition. Thalen was silent. He lowered his head for a moment, deeply conflicted. But Elitis was right. He needed to save his citadel and his plan. He slowly turned back and looked at the rest of them, then commanded. Rally all the drifters in the citadel, every single one, whether on duty or not. There's about to be an attack on the city. Chapter 1029. Diabolical Science. Within 30 minutes of Thalen's order, the compound of Therian Citadel was swarming with activity. People outside wondered what was happening. Alertness peaked because not just Therian but even the public citadel of Drywall was assembling as many drifters as possible. A lockdown order had been passed and people were being kept off the streets as much as possible. An evacuation to the inner sanctum of the city was underway, where the Chancellor resided. The place led to an underground shelter that could house 20,000 people. In fact, this shelter wasn't really a shelter but the first city that was called Drywall before another one was created on the surface. The underground city now served many purposes, but today it was being used to keep the citizens safe. However, South Drywall had a population of over 50,000 citizens, although 20% of that population, let's say, were drifters and would be participating in whatever was about to happen. But that wasn't Therian's problem to figure out. It was the government's. After all, they were the very cause of this. And now they were going to be staying in the inner sanctum while the drifters of Private Citadel fought to protect their mistake. Therian had gotten most of the information from Elitis and the development of things. Elitis had also mentioned that Northern had instructed that he come here. So the gentleman had to ride Erisiles all the way to South Drywall to inform Therian about all that was happening. Of course, this plan was something Northern privately informed him about when he thought he was going to be traveling to Verilania. Northern had expressed it as a contingency in case things went haywire. Who knew that it would have been a brilliant decision to help at least Thalen Citadel and most especially Therian and his hidden agenda prepare for what was coming. Thalen stood at the balcony of the Citadel building watching down as people gathered. Elitis was behind him, silent. He had been silent since all of this was going on. But there was something nagging his mind. He took a step forward and spoke calmly. Mind if I ask Lord Therian where are the Void Lord's parents? Thalen looked back. The Void Lord? He was confused for a moment. Are you referring to Sage Rian? Elitis nodded. Where are his parents? Thalen turned to the front. Shortly after Rian left, they also left according to what they told me. They were going to be heading to Sinkian. First Shin expressed plans of going to the Karen Canyon. Elitis looked down with a subtly dark gaze. He wants to go back there. Thalen shrugged his shoulders. He is a scion of the Kageyama clan after all. Elitis exhaled and his gaze returned to the usual gentleness. The Kageyama hold is the one place where I can't hear from. Their mystery art passed down through heritage is a very difficult one to crack. I worry greatly for the Void Lord's parents. I worry for them too. But Shin is strong and Lady Aisha is stronger. Both of them might just be masters, but I believe they stayed masters because they knew of what detriment they could be to the world if they continued to grow. Still, at masters a sage cannot take them out. And I'm sure together they can escape a paragon even if it's the Kageyama patriarch. Elitis adjusted his monocle. I hear his offspring are diabolical though. Thalen was silent for a while, his face grim as a hateful memory surfaced in his mind. Elitis did not see it but later noted it in his strong and almost hostile voice. I once had a brush with the third son. He is a madman. And I don't think any being of such should be allowed to freely roam the world. That guy deserves to be locked up in an asylum never to be seen again till he passes away. Elitis was silent. He adjusted his monocle once more. Indeed, they are diabolical. Alistran entered the balcony and stood beside Thalen, making the headmaster turn his head. What did you find? Alistran sighed. He was right. I have never seen anything like this. Men and monsters are marching together. Thalen's brows furrowed. What? Alistran shook his head. I tell you man, I felt my stomach sink when I saw it. The very thing we are supposed to be warring against is allied with our own kind to destroy us. All must be laughing at us right now. I can't even imagine how disappointed the stars would be if they were alive. Thalen looked away from Alistran and stared into the distance beyond the wall. The movement could be noted subtly in the forest. and for an elf like him he could hear a subtle vibration through the ground. So he knew they were still far, but he also knew they were coming. By night most likely they'd reach the wall. Breaking through the wall would take another few hours. But Thalen did not plan to give them that advantage. The wall was the city's gem of defense. He was going to take advantage of it and crush the dam attack. The problem was, he didn't know what to expect. Thalen believed that if he was thinking like this, then any other person was thinking like this. So there was a high chance that there was some strategy in place that would foil his. He exhaled steadily, cold smoke coming out of his mouth. Let's talk to Erickson. Alistran nodded. I agree with that. Elias turned his head slightly to look at the two of them. Now he was curious who this Erickson guy was. Alistran stepped back and walked away from the balcony. A moment later a young scrawny boy with freckles hugging a big book and frequently adjusting his big round glasses came to the balcony. Elias shifted to one side to give both the boy and Alistran more space. He stuck to the side of the wall like a passive observer. Chapter 1030. Drywall's impending crisis. Erickson bowed shyly. Headmaster, you called for me. Thalen turned around his back to the academy compound. Then he smiled at Erickson. I need your brain for a moment. The boy smiled shyly while Thalen continued. As you're well aware, we're under attack, so to speak. Let me ask, what do you think this city's greatest weapon is? Erickson adjusted his glasses and looked down briefly. I haven't been able to integrate fully with the entire city, so I can't say completely. However, the first is the wall, sir. Thalen raised his brows. First? Are you implying there's more? Erickson nodded. Yes, there is. And I think if I can complete my integration, I'll be able to fully discover the others. Thalen frowned. How long will that take? Erickson counted on his fingers. He stopped at 4. About 4 days? That's if I have the time to actively work on it. I've been at it passively for about a month now. If I'd known such a thing would happen, I would have been faster. Thalen shook his head. There was no way any of us could have known. Right now, how many things are you integrated into? The wall, the buildings, and the city itself. But the city integration is incomplete. I can cut it off and integrate into something else if you want. Thalen paused, his eyes reflecting how deep he was lost in thought. He exhaled and folded his arms. What do you think we should do? The enemies are going to attack the wall. Right now, let's say the wall is the gem in our hands. We can just use it and ensure the enemy never crosses. But I feel like it's too obvious a solution. They'd definitely expect something like that. Erickson adjusted his glasses. You're right to feel that way, sir. Because the drywall's defense is only second to the academy's. Thalen nodded. So you're saying they'll be thinking of another strategy? Erickson adjusted his glasses, looking into Thalen's eyes for the first time. Not just that, sir. It could be that they have a surefire way to break the wall's defense. I don't think in such a battle it would be easy to abandon the strategy of breaking the wall. It's dangerous. If they fail, the wall could be their end. They have to consider that too. So while they could have another strategy, they can't abandon the wall. But we also don't know what their other strategies would be. Isn't that concerning? Erickson nodded in agreement. It is. But we want them to come into the city anyway. Thalen frowned slightly. Eric, you haven't fully integrated with the city. No, sir. I don't need full integration. I can use what I already have. Although there will be limitations, it will be something. So far in studying the city, I've discovered it has a strange structure. It functions like a nervous system. Patterns. Tensions. Energy shifts. That's why the wall is only the first weapon. It's obvious, rigid, defensive by nature. But this city feels like it wasn't built for defense alone. Like it was built to deceive. To trap. Thalen leaned in slightly, his arms still folded. Trap? Erickson's voice gained conviction as he responded. Yes. The second weapon is hidden in its design. A recursive illusion. Defensive architecture designed not just to hold enemies back, but to make them think they're winning. Every section, every alley, every curve of the wall forms a pattern. A misdirection. It would be flawless if I could finish the integration. But we can still use what I know to achieve great results. Thalen was silent for a few heartbeats. Then he looked at Erickson again. Eric, how exactly is this going to play out? What exactly is the city? Eric nodded and adjusted his glasses. It's no secret that Drywall was first an underground city. I'm not sure of its original purpose, but I think the city above was constructed to serve as a trap to destroy enemies should it ever be invaded. Thalen rubbed his weathered chin. The first city was underground, that makes sense. So what exactly are we going to do if we let them in? Eric exhaled and finally loosened his grip on the book he was holding. As he loosened his grip, the book floated, turned, and opened itself. The passive observer behind adjusted his monocle and muttered beneath his breath. Oh? But no one minded him. All their attention was focused on the book's blank page. As Eric began to speak, black ink drew itself across the page, tracing out the city's structure. We invite the siege. Let them tear through the outer gate. Let them take the market quadrant here. And when they think they've won, we close the loop. Shift the walls. Collapse the streets behind them. Trap their vanguard with illusions that rot morale. He paused, then looked up at Thalen. We don't just fight the enemy. We erase their sense of direction. Confuse their instincts. Kill their will before we kill their flesh. It's going to be a gradual growing process. We can also shift the buildings into a maze, separate them, and send the Citadel elites to deal with them. The air was silent for a moment. Alistair cleared his throat. Ahem. I must admit, this is brilliant. He nodded. Thalen also agreed. I know it's good. Almost too good. Erickson looked at both of them before adding. I'm well aware that this plan can be disrupted in any manner. There's also the fact that I only have about 50% integration, so the systems might not fully obey me. Thalen smiled and tapped his shoulder. Since when is there nothing that can't affect a plan? There's always something, Eric, and you can't control every circumstance. There are bound to be variables. So this is good enough. He patted his brown, rough hair, disheveling it. Erickson smiled as the book closed, and he collected it and hugged it. Well, this is a solid plan. Why don't you work with Alistair? You two can collaborate, but don't let him limit your creativity. Be free to express yourself however you want. Alistair frowned. Hey, I don't limit people's creativity. Thalen ignored him completely and gave a thumbs up to Erickson. Go wild, boy. Chapter 1031. Elites of Therian Citadel. Headmaster, the Citadel elites have gathered. Thalen withdrew his gaze from the compound to look at the man standing at the entrance watching him. Thank you, treasure. He faced the passive observer by the side. Master Elitis, do you care to join us? Perhaps you could help us in some way as we discuss the way forward. Elitis was silent for almost a second, then he bowed and walked inside. Thalen also followed. Behind the balcony was an expansive hall that looked like a dining area for a large party, but most of the chairs were stacked against the walls of the building. Glamorous and glittering chandeliers dropped down from the ceiling, hanging quite low, their light subtle but reflective and brightening the white theme of the entire enclosure. A few people were scattered around. Some stood alone while others stood with each other. As they saw Thalen enter, all of them slowly began to walk towards each other. Within a minute, they were standing side by side in total silence, waiting for the headmaster. From the left side to the right side, there were a total of 11 of them. Thalen was silent for a moment, then he turned to Elitis. These are the 12 strongest drifters in the Therian Citadel. Of course, minus me and Alistair. Oh, and yeah, one of them right now is not around. Elitis carefully looked at all of them from his left to his right. Then he calmly spoke. Of course, how would I not know? He began to list. The weakest among the 12. Rex Brunhart, the street fighter. A guy with spiky red hair responded with a dark frown. I prefer to be called least strongest rather than weakest. Elitis continued anyway. Then the rank 11, if I may say, the Phantom Lady Lyra Sen. The lady with jet black hair frowned but said nothing. Rank 10, the Queen of Boom Nova Vix. A girl with bright blonde twin buns with sharp-cut bangs grinned pompously. Humph. Elitis looked over to the next person, paused a little, then continued. I'm guessing this is where things get truly powerful. He bowed his head slightly to a silver-haired man with calm, focused eyes and soft lashes. Rank 9, Sail of the White String. The Arrow Sage. The young man barely bowed his head, a little surprised but his focus never wavering. If anything, he seemed burdened by them. Rank 8, Half-Cut. Your reputation precedes you. The boy he was talking to had strange hair. Half his side was black and the other half was white. He had sharp, cool cyan eyes and a third-degree burn mark over his left eye. Rank 7, Lady Helena is not currently around, as you have mentioned. He turned to the next person on the line and bowed lightly. Rank 6, the Blood Doll Jinxa. The lady with blue electric hair and extremely pale skin looked away and paid Elitis no attention. He naturally went on to the scarred-faced man standing next to her. Rank 5, Zaire Vorn, the Marked Blade. He had spiked blonde hair with streaks of deep black and faint violet, like the remnants of fire and shadow mingled. His violet iris eyes glowed with a subtle yet dangerous hostility. Elitis turned to the next person. Rank 4, Ghost of the Grey Lantern. The fact that I do not even know your name goes to prove how evasive you are. The young man he was referring to had a short stature, cold steel-gray irises with a piercing calm look, the kind of stare that makes people freeze without being told. Black marks ran from his forehead to his lower face. A lightning-shaped scar beside his left eye, clearly surgical or intentional, as if something unnatural had happened to his vision. He had thick layered dark hair framing his face like a hunter's hood, lending him both mystery and menace. He looked at Elitis with a cold stare. The fact that you know that moniker is enough for me to be wary of you. Elitis chuckled lightly and looked at the short boy with reflective hot pink glasses and fluffy blonde hair, unkempt like he'd woken up mid-explosion. Rank 3-1 should definitely not be deceived by appearance. Zeke Zephroid. The Riot. The boy was chewing gum and just continued chewing his gum. The other two standing after him made Elitis hesitate. He gently breathed to steady himself, then bowed deeply to the man standing next to Zeke Zephroit. The Silent One of Light. Zahir Alnor. Clan heir of the Nor clan. It is an honor to meet a clan from the northern continent. Piercing emerald eyes stared down at Elitis. They were almost haunting the eyes of a man who had seen through 1,000,000 lies and easily lived through 1,000 assassinations. His white hair was wrapped tightly in an ornate desert-style turban with a feather. Half of his face was hidden with a scarf, leaving only his eyes visible. He gestured with his fingers, which were adorned with silver knuckle rings. "Thank you." Elitis then moved on to the last person standing on the line. Before he could start, however, the man shot out his hand forward, extending his palm. "Stop." Elitis hesitated. "I know what you are going to do. You are going to bow to me and say," he perfectly imitated Elitis' calm voice, "Rank 1 trickster of the Red Threads Gordon." He tilted his head a little, sounding with a defensive tone. "But I will have you know, I am no trickster. People just misunderstand. They always do. And no one really believes me." Elitis smiled subtly. "Of course." The young man scratched his wild tousled blonde hair that obscured his eyes. He was wearing robes with elaborate designs and sashes with 2 gourds hanging down the sashes. He pointed to the gentleman in front of him. "And you, a man that I have never seen before. You come here, know every single one of us, even the ones that shouldn't be known. Only one name comes to mind." There was silence in the air. "Elitis, right?" "What?" All of them sounded almost simultaneously. The third rank Zeke Zephroit brought down his glasses a little. "Are you kidding me? The Elitis?" Elitis bowed gently. "It is my honor to meet the elites of Therian Citadel." Chapter 1032. The enigmatic Elitis. "This is rather shocking. I thought so you are the leader of Elitis?" Zeke's glasses were still down, studying the gentleman with doubting eyes. Elitis merely smiled softly. "Leader? Perhaps it would be fitting to say I am a leader of myself, but I am not. The Void Lord is. I am merely a name bearing the name Elitis." Zeke winced and tilted his head back. The spiky red-haired guy Rex spoke. "So you're saying it's just you? The rumored Elitis is just you?" Elitis nodded. "There's never been an organization." Zeke yanked on his hair like he was going to go insane. "You, that is so crazy. How do you pull it off? How do you know the things you do? How come you surpass several renowned information organizations when it's just you?" Elitis chuckled softly. "It wouldn't be wise of me to reveal the secret of my trade now, would it?" Zeke nodded in acceptance, frowning a little. "True, true." All the elites were thrown into disorder as they tried to comprehend the enigmatic human standing before them. Others whispered to each other, confused as to who or what Elitis was and why everyone was freaking out. Thalen exhaled and clapped once. Immediately the atmosphere fell silent. All of them turned to him. All of them except Gurdon, who simply sat on the ground and crossed his legs. He leaned his head on one hand. "Hey Thalen, what exactly is going on?" Thalen looked toward Gurdon's direction and sighed. He didn't seem to care about the young man's disorderly nature or actions. "It's a disaster. It's no news that we will soon be under attack, but what to expect? I can't tell you enough. What we do know is that we are going to be attacked by an allied army of monsters and men." The air shifted ominously. Despite the fact that his golden hair was shrouding his eyes, a cold light could be seen from somewhere within the strands. He said in a flat tone, "Oh, that is bad news." Thalen nodded subtly. "Bad news indeed, friend." Zeke was furious. "And it makes no sense either. Why would humans ally with monsters?" Elitis responded to that. "We suspect the involvement of a tyrant in this." At once the air grew even darker. Zeke's speech broke. Tyrant?" Lyra the Phantom Lady whispered to her friend. "Hey Nova, aren't tyrants supposed to be super strong? Like beyond Zenith strong?" The Queen of Boom responded with a sharp tone. "Obviously." Sail of the White String spoke next, with a very gentle tone but firm and resolute. "Master Elitis, please do not mind our slovenly state. Did you really say tyrant? A tyrant, aside from the fact that they are an existence that shouldn't be in this world, I think it is fair to say a tyrant is as strong as a zenith. But we can't even be accurate because there has never been a zenith since the birth of drifters." Elitis nodded. "You are very right, Master Sail. A tyrant is stronger than a zenith. But as to your other statement, while it is arguable, I prefer to remain silent." Sail frowned slightly. "I would have loved to urge you not to, but I presume that would be time-wasting?" Elitis nodded with a gentlemanly smile. Gurdon clicked his tongue, continuing with a flat, humorless tone. "A tyrant pulling strings, huh? Then it makes sense how monsters are allied with humans. The rifts and their environment have shown us the monstrosity of the tyrants and origins. Every renowned drifter knows that those lot are a forsaken existence. They seized power itself and perverted it. If one of them is devising a plot against us, aren't we practically being violated? It might take the entire continent to stop whatever this is." Elitis nodded lightly. Lord Gurdon is correct. This is merely a process. What they hope to achieve will soon be fulfilled. And the entire Central Plains need to come together to defend against this disaster, or else it could collapse. The marked blade Zaire chuckled lightly. He said slowly with a cold voice, "At least we are sure a powerhouse won't watch its continent collapse." Zeke glanced at him. "The Empire? Are you talking about the Empire?" For the first time Zaire spoke, his voice low and velvet smooth. "You are wrong. Riemgard does not care. They are a world that exists independently. Unless they are affected, they will not interfere." Zaire hesitated. "But there is no way the destruction of the Central Plains doesn't concern them." Zaire was the tallest in the room, so his gaze was always cast down at everyone. Not to mention the coldness that emanated from his eyes. People hesitated to speak to him because it was difficult to know when he was displeased and when he was not. Besides, he was incredibly strong and unbounded by morals. Associating with him was simply wishing to be killed one day if you made a foolish mistake, which he wouldn't perceive as foolish because of his antisocial nature. If the enemy is smart, they are probably making plans that will not affect Riemgard. If they are, that means the tyrant is not as strong as one should be. He paused and slowly shifted his haunting gaze. The tyrant is weakened. If they weren't, there'd be no need for an army. Elitis thought deeply about what the man said, then subtly shook his head. While Lord Zaire could be right, I think that is not enough of a standard to judge the strength of the enemy. One thing I do know perfectly well is that this large-scale war is all a part of his plan. He looked at them and continued. I am hoping that when my master comes I will get a full understanding of the matter. Even I am faced against a wall as tall as the academies. Oh, Gordon chuckled lightly. It is difficult to imagine a man of your caliber with a master. Thalen grinned. I thought so too. But do you know what is even more astonishing? Gordon tilted his head. I didn't care half a second ago, but with how excited you sound I am curious to find out. Thalen grinned even wider. His master is a member of our citadel. The air went dead silent. Chapter 1033. Battle teams assemble. Headmaster, there should be a limit to your fantasy, you know? Zeke said with a disappointed tone. Others also looked away and sighed. At that moment Thalen's weathered face became flustered. What? He is right here. Why just straight out dismiss me when you can ask him? Jinxa yawned and rolled her eyes. I'm getting tired of all this. Do you need us to crush necks, or do you want to chat all day? Thalen looked at her and exhaled. Then he suddenly grinned. Now that I think about it, the end of the continent is coming. It might not be a bad idea to have a party. All of them grimaced at him and uttered at the same time. No, we are not having a party. Zeke added. And we are not going to spend the whole day talking either. After all, our attackers are barely 10 kilometers away. Thalen nodded. Zeke is right. There's still much to be discussed, but first I want to tell you all how this is going to go. All of them paid attention, even Gurdon, where he was seated, focused on Thalen. We will all be dividing ourselves into groups of 3, and each group will be assigned to different sections and different roles. Of course, this grouping does not include Zeke, Gurdon, and Zaire. Those 3 will act independently. Rex muttered with an arrogant frown. Of course. Zaire, Jinxa, and Rex, Team 1. Rex's face immediately paled. He raised his head and shouted, pointing to Jinxa. What? Why? Why would you put me on the same team with that woman? Thalen fixed a stern gaze at him, making him shrink back. Lyra Nova and Sir Sale will form the second team. Sale bowed politely in response. Half-Cut and Grey will form the third team. The fourth, fifth, and sixth teams will be Zeke, Zaire, and Gurdon. All of them nodded. Thalen inhaled deeply and exhaled, then he looked them all in the eye as he spoke. This is going to probably be a brutal battle. I have no idea what to expect, but I hope that none of us loses our life. We can move to the front lines for now. Information will be dispersed as the need arises. You guys are also there to provide aid to the lacking areas around you. Whenever you see an enemy that is too difficult for others to handle, deal with it as a team. He particularly faced Rex. Do not be reckless and charge in alone. Rex frowned and looked away reluctantly. Thalen sighed once more and folded his arms. That should be all for now. Thank you all very much. As they all dispersed, Zaire raised his hand slowly. Thalen looked at him with a slightly raised brow. I want to take the boy. Thalen sighed. Zaire, he is not something you can just use to feel cold. Besides, isn't the cold weather enough for you? Zahire's eyes narrowed a little. Far from it. I want the boy. His talent makes everywhere feel like home. It makes mine even more potent. Thalen was silent for a while, studying Zaire and thinking of what to do with his peculiar attachment to Ryan's talent. He eventually sighed. All right, but do protect him. That's a given. Zaire also left the room, slowly walking behind the others. After they had all left, the remaining people in the room were Savant, Treasure, Elitis, Thalen, and Gurdon. Gurdon folded his arms and looked towards the walls of the city. There was silence in the room before Thalen breathed softly and asked in a low tone, "What is going on in your mind?" Gordon was distracted for a minute, then he suddenly turned to Thalen and pointed to himself. "Me? Oh. PFTTT. Nothing. This is all a mess we didn't see coming. It feels unreal but is actually happening. Worse still, we feel alone in this." Thalen nodded. "I think the enemy intentionally isolated not just us but every nation. There is a high chance that the military is attacking every single nation." He walked forward slowly. "I spoke to the government official before the evacuation began, and they said there's been underground intelligence of Dante killing the governor of Arcadia, and has been mobilizing the military even since before then." Gordon tilted his head. "The new Paragon? Ouch, that is so cliché. I don't know, but anyone would have expected this. But what anyone wouldn't have expected is how a tyrant fits into all of this." Elitis spoke at this point. "That is a much larger story that even we are not yet sure of. This said tyrant was only recognized by the Void Lord. I had come in contact with him once, and he had programmed me to act as a medium to put the Void Lord in certain circumstances to wear him down. Which worked perfectly well. This is what my master and I believed." Gordon looked at him for a few seconds. He was silent, and with his golden hair shrouding his eyes completely, it was difficult to read his expression. He turned his head to Thalen. "By Void Lord does he mean your guy?" Thalen glanced at Elitis and slowly looked back to Gordon. "I think so. Honestly, I am slightly confused too." He turned back to Elitis. "How exactly did Rian become your master? What is this Void Lord you keep calling him? Can't be associated with the Void, right?" Elitis smiled gently. You know about the Void." For a moment he was smiling. The next, however, his face seemed to go pale and a bead of sweat slowly crawled down his face. He inhaled and exhaled several times, trembling. Gordon looked at Thalen. Thalen also looked back. Even Savant Treasure was alarmed for Elitis. It looked like the gentleman was reliving a harrowing experience. He eventually sighed deeply and steadied his shoulders. He lowered his head for a moment, brought out a white handkerchief and cleaned his face. Then he raised his head, adjusted his monocle and smiled. The Void. How refreshing. Chapter 1034. And the war begins. The night was growing comfortable, spreading its invisible tendrils and drowning the atmosphere in pitch-black darkness. The streets of South Drywall were barren and sparse, the cold night breeze the only thing that patrolled the littered avenues. Some stray creatures played among the debris. There was one known as the canbird, a winged beast with an elongated beak that loved to perch on cans and devour metal. The pecking of the canbird created a hollow rhythmic beat of impending doom. In the silent and deserted streets of Drywall, the hollow wind made it even more ominous. The night itself drenched everything in a cold sense of dread. All the citadels that resided in the city had joined the army, though no citadel possessed the manpower to contribute as much as Therian Citadel. This was expected because usually every citadel claimed a city or nation as their base, the foundation they first allied with and which served as their backbone. There were, of course, independent citadels that had dominated certain regions. The Calvin Citadel, for example. The city wall stood 33 feet tall with a wavy structure from afar built to adapt to the uneven terrain of the opposing forest. All along the walls different armor and colored attire moved in formation. Among the colorful differences, many were uniformly clad in dark silvery armor and deep green tabards patrolling the ramparts. Some loaded ballistas while others prepared their arrows. 5 towers spanned the wall's expanse, each equipped with massive trebuchets for hurling large metallic javelins. Besides, these mounted ballista turrets were positioned at different sections of the wall. Since these were more expensive to install, only 3 existed across the entire expanse. The atmosphere along the wall remained lively despite the impending doom. Perhaps the soldiers were confident the wall wouldn't fall, or they trusted their leaders. Either way, they didn't look hopeless at all. They went about their work as if it were just another drill. One drifter in a brown long coat and red headband stared forward, narrowing his violet eyes before frowning. He tapped his friend. "Hey Jolter, isn't that darkness strange?" Jolter, a buzz-cut boy with stern deep eyes, stared forward too and frowned immediately. "Feels like it's moving? I knew I wasn't seeing things." Jolter turned slightly. "Should we alert the—" Before he could finish, a loud horn blasted into the sky. Immediately everyone readied themselves, knocking their bows and loading the ballistas. Gazes hardened and people stopped jesting and chatting. Everyone was completely focused. The war was about to begin. The wall fell silent as everyone watched with cold, stern expressions. Now that stillness had settled, it was easy to see the darkness moving across the forest surface, consuming everything. Suddenly something streaked out of the darkness, flying toward the wall at horrifying speed. However, a black-haired drifter with raven eyes quickly shifted the turret he was handling and fired a shot upward. A powerful explosion scattered in the air, causing flames and debris to rain down into the forest. Everyone was alerted by that first strike. Following it, several more projectiles began shooting out of the darkness. Now it wasn't just one person responding. All the ballista handlers and drifters whose talents could shoot projectiles raised their hands and began bombarding the things flying out of the darkness. The bombardment intensified as more projectiles emerged from the writhing darkness. Explosions lit the night sky in bursts of orange and white, casting fleeting shadows across the determined faces on the wall. "There are too many of them," shouted a drifter as he frantically reloaded his crossbow. The projectiles weren't just random debris. They moved with purpose, weaving through the defensive fire with unnatural agility. Captain Morven of the Verilian Citadel, distinguished by his crimson cloak and battle-scarred armor, raised his voice above the chaos. "Hold the line. Don't let them breach the outer perimeter." But as the darkness crept closer to the wall's base, something far more disturbing began to unfold. The consumed forest itself seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Trees that had stood for centuries now swayed without wind, their branches reaching toward the wall like grasping fingers. Then came the first wave. Creatures burst from the shadow storm. But these weren't ordinary beasts. A pack of wolves emerged, their eyes glowing with an eerie violet light, moving in perfect synchronization. Behind them, a group of what had once been human soldiers marched forward, their movements too precise, too coordinated. "By the old stars," Jolter whispered, his bow trembling slightly. "Those are Calvern Nation uniforms. Why is the Calvern Nation attacking us alongside monsters?" The violet-eyed drifter beside him squinted through the darkness. "Something's wrong with them. Look at how they move." The possessed army advanced with mechanical precision. Humans and monsters alike moved as extensions of a single terrible will. Arrows from the wall found their marks, but the possessed barely flinched. Those who fell simply rose again, dark tendrils of shadow knitting their wounds closed. A massive trebuchet groaned as it launched a boulder into the advancing horde. The impact created a crater, but the darkness immediately began to fill it, and more corrupted figures emerged from the depths of the shadow storm. "Captain!" A lookout from the eastern tower called out. "The darkness. It's trying to reach the wall's foundation." Morven's eyes widened as he realized the true horror of their situation. The shadow storm wasn't just bringing an army. It was trying to consume the very ground beneath them. Wherever it touched, the earth itself seemed to turn against the defenders. All drifters with earth talents to the base of the wall. Now, several figures in brown leather leaped from the ramparts, their hands already glowing with elemental power. They pressed their palms to the stone, reinforcing it with layers of hardened earth and rock, just as the first tendrils of darkness licked at the foundation. Where shadow met stone, an ominous hissing sound filled the air, and cracks began to spiderweb across the wall's surface. The war had truly begun, but the defenders still believed they were fighting an army. They had no idea they were battling the very essence of corruption itself, and that their greatest enemy wasn't the creatures charging toward them, but the creeping darkness that sought to claim their souls. Chapter 1035. Sale of the White String, Part 1. The battlefield only got worse. Drifters and monsters alike began scaling the wall, and the defenders of Drywall unleashed their arrows. Arrows of flames, arrows of searing light. Drifters wielding projectile abilities let loose everything they had, smashing the monsters and hurling them back down before they could climb any substantial distance. However, they had the shadow storm itself to worry about. The darkness crept closer, more humans and monsters pouring from its depths, and it was only a matter of time before their fate atop the wall was sealed. Many soldiers tried to strike it, but their attacks proved utterly futile. The shadow storm sometimes hurled the attacks back at the wall, causing massive sections to explode. Some drifters plummeted and were immediately swarmed by monsters who mercilessly gouged out their eyes. As their comrades fell, the surviving defenders surged with greater courage and defiant will to win this battle. Their eyes blazed and their voices soared through the air with every attack they launched into the shadow storm, or used to halt the advance of drifters and monsters scaling the wall. The battle had just begun, yet it was already brutal, voices of agony and fury weaving together to create a devastating symphony of death and destruction. The wall held, but only because the darkness advancing toward them moved slowly. However, its approach was inevitable. Second by second, crawl by crawl, it drew closer. Many drifters' eyes remained fixed on it. Even as they fired arrows downward, they would pause to stare at the towering wall of darkness, now closer than ever before. Besides the Calvern Nation, other notable soldiers were charging from the storm, clashing as they attempted to scale the wall. Captain Morven, a savant, currently commanded the wall's defense. Beyond being a prestigious member of Verilian Citadel, he had also served as a kingdom general. Siege battles were familiar ground to him, unlike other drifters. He was doing exceptional work, except the shadow storm was something far beyond his experience. None of them even knew whether to regard it as a monster or some constructed phenomenon born from an enemy's abilities. He harbored a grim suspicion about what would happen if it eventually breached the wall. Kingdom soldiers who should be thousands of miles apart were mindlessly fighting together in a neutral city, something that would never occur under normal circumstances. Which meant it was only a matter of time before they too became pawns of the darkness. The thought made Morven's blood run cold. He gritted his teeth as he knocked another arrow, drew it back with muscles straining and released. The arrow spiraled downward and crushed the skull of a three-eyed monster. With tremendous force, the beast peeled off the wall and plummeted to the ground, dragging numerous other monsters and drifters with it. The earth erupted in a shockwave of dust as it crashed. Captain Morven had already aimed his bow elsewhere and loosed another arrow before the monster hit the ground. His expression was grim and resolute, though worry was etched deep in his features despite his efforts to hide it. The wall was his responsibility. He had to defend it. He couldn't let the darkness claim the wall. He faced the darkness again and opened his hand. Liquid silver material formed and extended into a long, thin, razor-sharp javelin. He shifted his leg back, scraping against the concrete floor of the wall, inhaled deeply, drawing his belly in as he pulled his arm back. Then he exhaled and the javelin exploded from his grip. It streaked through the air and vanished into the darkness, only to return barely a second later. Captain Morven's eyes widened. A shield of the same material materialized before him moments before the javelin smashed into the wall, sending stone shrapnel flying in all directions. Even Captain Morven couldn't withstand the tremendous force of his own attack. He was hurled backward to the ground. He gritted his teeth and was already rising. Meanwhile, another drifter had covered his position, releasing a long arrow and sending it streaking downward. The shadow storm was growing, disturbingly consistent with its counterattacks. In fact, it now launched projectiles of its own, obliterating sections of the wall's front. This left many drifters disoriented. Priority shifted from shooting downward to watching for incoming strikes. 2 ballistas had already been obliterated by the shadow storm's assault. Now the enemy grew unerringly coordinated. Both monsters and humans used each other as ladders, linking arms and legs together, scaling the wall with eerie precision like a colony of ants. The battle had barely lasted 30 minutes, yet the tide was already shifting. The drifters, whose eyes had blazed with defiant light and iron resolve, now trembled. As if that weren't enough, monsters began erupting from the darkness, airborne. Captain Morven's eyes widened in horror. What? They had aerial forces all along. They were toying with us? He'd considered the possibility that the shadow storm might be a monster, but witnessing this coordinated assault, he knew better. This had to be a human's ability. The enemy had deliberately let them exhaust themselves so aerial forces could sweep in for the kill. Of course, they'd prepared countermeasures for aerial attacks. But of all their defensive strategies, it was the weakest. Turrets swiveled upward, but they were sluggish. The aerial monsters spread their wings and shrieked through the air with breathtaking speed. They slammed onto the wall, tearing through metal with razor fangs and crushing their iron beaks into drifter skulls. They were fast, too fast, and this was precisely what crippled their defensive strategy. Still, there was a counter-strategy. Captain Morven exhaled and opened his hands again, materializing another silver javelin. This one longer, sharper, thinner. He hurled it skyward and staggered back, gasping. He braced himself against his knee for a moment. I guess it's time for the champions to enter the fray. Just as he spoke, the wind current began to surge. It started steady, then rose so violently that drifters struggled to keep their footing. Their cloaks and clothes whipped savagely against the gale. Captain Morven staggered back, shielding his eyes as he peered skyward. He could vaguely make out something in the heavens. They're here already. High above, standing on a platform of invisible wind, was a man clad in flowing white robes adorned with leaf motifs and nature-bound patterns. He gripped a massive bow that appeared carved from sacred wood. The bowstring was pure white light. The man's silver hair lashed against the fierce wind, his eyes calm and unwavering as monsters fluttered around him, struggling desperately to reach him. Finally, he raised his bow and plucked the string once. In that instant, everything seemed to freeze. Then a torrential rain of arrows baptized the battlefield. Chapter 1036. Lyra and Nova. Arrows of light poured from the sky. At first, drifters turned away, shielding themselves, but belatedly noticed it was only the front section of the wall. The space from the front all the way to the forest that darkness had consumed was being battered by a rain of arrows. Slowly, the drifters stood upright, relieved, staring and muttering. Wait. Those arrows? No way. Sail of the White String. Therian Citadel is sending their elites. We're saved. We're going to win this battle. I can't believe it. For a moment, I almost nut in my pants. Shall let's fight like hell. The soldiers rose again, their eyes blazing. They drew their arrows and aimed downward. However, someone else landed on the edge of the wall. The figure made them pause, freeze, and almost forget to breathe. A slender young lady with sharp-cut bangs and twin buns. Her amber-orange eyes were intense, calculating, and dangerous. She wore a bodysuit that seemed out of place in the surrounding culture. A cropped, asymmetrical combat top with shoulder cutouts, tactically bold for unrestricted movement, and high-waisted tactical pants with glossy finished side buckles and harness details. She opened her hands, revealing small, colorful balls between her fingers. Immediately, she dropped down the wall. The moment they made contact with the first monster, a chain of explosions erupted and the entire wall trembled. The sound was thunderous, swallowing everything within the vicinity. Everyone clutched their ears and crouched from the deafening noise. Everyone except her, who stood on the edge of the trembling wall, staring down with a sweet, playful smile. The explosions were radiant and colorful like her eyes. As they receded, she clapped happily for herself, dancing tenderly on the wall's edge like a ballerina, never missing a step. With just 2 members of Therian Citadel's elite team revealing themselves, the situation had stabilized. Such was the power of the Citadel. Another member revealed herself. No one knew she was there until she spoke. She sighed. "I can't believe I was useless." The orange-eyed lady Nova tilted her head and stepped down from the wall's edge, walking to her friend. "No need to worry. I'm sure the headmaster knew what he was doing when he grouped us together. I mean, you're a master, yet even Sir Sale isn't as skilled a combatant as you are." She stared at her friend. "You really suck at making me feel better." Nova grinned. "I've never actually tried." The entire place quaked again, causing Nova to look around with confusion. "My explosions should be finished, though?" Lyra frowned. At that moment, someone was walking toward them. She grabbed Nova by the shoulder, pushed her aside, and streaked forward like lightning. As she reached the wall's edge, she collided with something. Something none of them could see. Caused a massive shockwave, and the wall shook again. Sale glanced down and narrowed his eyes, white light glinting in them. What? A monster capable of invisibility? He knew that was terrible news. First of all, and secondly, the monster had to be at least a destroyer. That was bad news. Lyra was a prodigy, but even she couldn't defeat a destroyer. "I need to get down there." However, the moment he decided, something plunged out of the shadow storm and headed straight for him. He immediately spun, wrapping himself in a violent gale of wind, and somehow shielding himself as the monster crashed into him and hurled him downward toward the city. Meanwhile, the creature that faced Lyra and Nova was revealing itself. Glistening azure skin came into view, glowing maliciously beneath the radiant moon. It wasn't completely standing on the wall. Its upper body was already on the wall, its head raised, yet it already looked like a living fortress. Its limbs were like massive columns fracturing the wall as it struggled to pull itself up. Lyra had collided with it, causing its invisibility to be undone. However, that hadn't done any damage to it. As the monster was revealed, Nova shouted, "Everyone, fall back." Without delay, people began to step back and retreat behind the wall. Meanwhile, Lyra was already moving forward. She streaked like a bolt of light, and as she approached the monster's forelimb, she was already swinging something from her back. It was a collapsible spear, but she wielded it strangely. She swung it at the monster's forelimb, and immediately lightning exploded from the strike. She staggered backward, and the monster's beautiful azure skin was shredded and charred but drew no blood. The monster's gaze was cold, calculating, almost cruel. Each of its breaths was like distant rumbling thunder. Slowly it shifted its long, jagged head toward Lyra. At that moment it was as though her legs went cold, unresponsive. "Lyra, what are you doing? Get out of the way." The monster had raised its long neck and head and was already striking down. It was only by last-moment reflexes that Lyra leaped and rolled away from the path. The monster crushed its jagged teeth onto the wall. However, as Lyra leaped away, Nova pulled something from her waist belt and threw it up. The balls unfolded into sophisticated drones with sleek designs. The drones began firing rapid shots at the monster, circling it from all sides. The monster was stuck trying to stand up, but the drones were disruptive. It shifted, tried to adjust, but the drones were fast, the shots were rapid, and they weren't stopping. No matter how it tried to smash the drones with its sharp long teeth, they were incredibly evasive, and it only seemed to grow frustrated. With that distraction in place, Lyra entered its space again. Her spear changed structure, getting longer, but the larger part of it was a cold bluish blade that seemed to crackle with lightning. She leaped into the air and fell down with the spear, driving it into the monster's scales and forcing it down. Now the monster truly bled. It let out a terrifying, thunderous cry of pain. Chapter 1037. Sale of the White String, Part 2. Sale was being dragged weightlessly by something he could barely see. What he at least knew was that the creature was white like snow and had vicious horns. In fact, it had bulldozed into him with those horns and had torn into his ribs. But that was of little concern right now. The problem was the city. The people had been evacuated, and falling into it shouldn't bring so much harm. However, the reason why he was at the front line of the wall, his major assignment was to prevent the enemy from entering the city for the next hour. Whether through breaching the wall or through the skysail, had 1 hour to prevent the monsters from breaking into the city. However, he was plummeting right into it, with one of them injured and being crushed down by a weight nearly 10 times his own. He clenched his teeth and extended his bow hand. As he extended the hand, the bow itself shifted and began to deconstruct, only to reconstruct. It grew thin and flew around, forming a garrote. Sale grabbed a part of the thick wire and barely stirred his hand, however it responded with a sharp and fast movement, swinging around the monster in one full swoop. He clenched his hand and drew it, making the wire go taut and immediately squeezing together the monster's white wings. Just as he was above the air of the city, he shifted his legs back and created a large platform of wind. Upon stepping on it, he was catapulted back into the sky. He moved and swung his hand as he did. It was unbelievable how he managed to hurl such a massive monster while moving through the air. However, it was the garrote itself that did most of the work. It was unlike an ordinary weapon. After all, this was something specially created by the rune crafters of Elmuish, the wooden city. The wood itself that the bow was made of was alive and was incredibly strong. He hauled the monster out of the vicinity of the city and rolled into the sky. The gale of the wind spun him viciously, adding more power to his momentum, and in one final swing, he unleashed the monster and sent it reeling into the darkness where it came from. However, Sale was shocked to his bones. The abomination unleashed its massive 4 wings mid-motion and halted on its own. Its ominous black eyes bore into him. They were rather discomforting to stare at. Not to even speak of the curved horns. One pair towards the front, the other pair towards the back. Long furry necks, white coats. Arms as large and strong as those of humans but covered in flowing white fur. And 4 massive wings. The creature gave Sale the creeps. He shivered slightly as if he was having a fever. Then he gripped the garrote in his hand. I am not going to enjoy killing you. I know you do not understand me, morbid thing. But at least know that I do not enjoy taking life of any kind. However, I do enjoy protecting the people I love. The garrote was losing its sharpness, forming a bow once again. If killing you is the only way to protect the people I love. He drew the string of light that appeared on the bow. Then die. He released it. The sound of his arrows flying was like the air being shattered. Each arrow was so fast that no eyes caught it. They barely whispered as they hit their target. The first arrow slammed into the monster's wing, causing it to reel backwards mid-flight. It had recovered from that when another one struck its legs, displacing a dangerous circle of shockwaves. Another flew and crashed into its chest, throwing it backwards. The monster rolled in the air, flying away. As it landed, a massive spear of light was already above it. The spear pierced through the air and struck, smashing the monster to the ground. The entire place shook as shockwaves flew outward. Sale stood on the wind platform for a moment, staring down with a fierce and resolute expression on his face. His gaze left no room for mercy. He was stern and kind both as a person and as a warrior. Even his battle style and heritage carried that very principle. He pulled the light string of his bow. A real arrow appeared on it, this time crafted from the nozzle of the bow to his fingers. And for that one terrifying arrow that the bow itself wove, hundreds more arrows of light appeared all around him, humming a very eerie and subtly dangerous vibration. Sale paused for a heartbeat. He squinted his eyes, watching as the mist of dust slowly cleared. He drew the string a little again, getting ready to release. However, he suddenly frowned. Huh? It's gone. His thoughts had barely formed when he felt the air around him vibrate. His eyes widened and his head twisted out of the way, out of pure reflex. A searing purple beam of pure burning essence flew and streaked past him. He rolled away from the path just in time, or so he thought, until a sharp, painful sting struck him around his jaw and neck area. He moved his hand towards the area only to find out that the whole place had been severely burned. He groaned a bit, his expression was strained as he tried to endure the intense pain. However, he didn't have all the time. The abomination was already opening its mouth again. How did it even move? What did I miss? Sale was already moving. He leaped from wind platform to wind platform, striking the string of his bow as though it was some musical instrument. The monster was delayed for a bit. It was also well aware it could not just shoot its strange beam, not when Sale kept jumping around the air. The monster was intelligent enough to want its strikes to hit. And that was what Sale wanted to confirm first of all. If it is intelligent, then it can be tricked. Chapter 1038. Sale of the White String, Part 3. Sale's mind raced as he bounded between the wind platforms, each leap calculated to maintain an erratic pattern. The creature's black eyes tracked his movements with predatory intelligence, confirming his suspicions. Good. Intelligence means patterns. Patterns mean weaknesses. He suddenly shifted direction mid-leap, feinting left before spinning right on a fresh platform. The monster's head followed the false movement for a split second, enough time for Sale to note the delay in its reactions. The creature's mouth began to glow with that ominous purple light again, but Sale was already 3 platforms away, the bow transforming in his hands. The living wood flowed like water, extending and branching until it resembled a massive net of interconnected branches. Let's see how smart you really are. His burned jaw throbbed with each word. He hurled the transformed weapon wide, the wooden net expanding as it flew. The creature predictably dodged, but that wasn't Sale's target. The net sailed past and began to circle back, the living wood responding to his mental command. The monster prepared another beam, this time aiming where Sale would land rather than where he was. Its intelligence was adapting, learning his patterns. But Sale smiled grimly. He had counted on exactly that. Instead of landing on the next platform, he dismissed it entirely and plummeted. The purple beam seared through empty air where he should have been, and in that moment of the creature's confusion the wooden net struck from behind. The living branches wrapped around the monster's wings not to bind them. Sale had learned that lesson, but to anchor himself. He swung on the net like a pendulum, the momentum carrying him in a wide arc that brought him face-to-face with the creature. His bow had already reformed in his hands. Gotcha, he breathed. At point-blank range, with the monster's mouth still glowing from the mist beam, Sale drew the string of light. This time he didn't aim for the wings or chest. He aimed for the throat. The arrow of pure light punched through the creature's neck just as it tried to unleash another beam. The result was catastrophic. The purple energy, with nowhere to go, exploded outward in all directions from the wound. Sale barely managed to swing away on his wooden net as waves of searing energy washed over them both. The creature's agonized shriek shattered windows in the distant city below, and 3 of its 4 wings beat frantically as it tried to maintain altitude. But Sale wasn't finished. The hundreds of light arrows that had been hovering around him earlier reformed, positioning themselves in a perfect sphere around the wounded creature. The monster looked around desperately, its black eyes wide with what might have been fear. "I told you I don't enjoy this." Sale's voice carried on the wind despite the distance. The burn on his jaw flared with pain, but his resolve remained absolute. "But I love them more than I hate killing you." The creature made one last desperate attempt, diving toward the city with its remaining strength. But Sale had anticipated this too. He raised his hand. Lunar Aria. The hundreds of arrows fell like a deadly constellation, each one guided by his will. They struck with surgical precision, wings joints the creature's center of mass. Not meant to kill outright, but to cripple, to ensure it could never reach the city below. The monster plummeted, its wings shredded, its body broken. It crashed into the dark forest beyond the city walls with a thunderous impact that sent tremors through the ground. Sale landed gracefully on a final wind platform, breathing heavily. He watched the dust settle around the creature's motionless form, his expression a mixture of relief and regret. He touched the burn on his jaw gingerly and winced. The pain was a reminder that intelligence could be as dangerous as brute strength, perhaps more so. In the distance he could see more shapes moving in the darkness beyond the wasteland. The real battle was just beginning. But for now he needed to tend to his teammates. He turned to dive toward the walls, only to see an azure-blue monster falling down the wall. He paused and smiled a little. Did I forget they're elites? He shifted and faced the darkness before him. Over time the slow march of the darkness had grown even slower. It had halted, perfectly forming a vast, endless black wall against the city's barriers. And this black wall dwarfed the city terribly. Sale stood on the wind platform he had formed, gripping his bow and staring, searching for ways to dispel the darkness. In his numerous escapades as a drifter, from nomad to sage, which had consumed 35 hard years of his life. Yes, despite his youthful appearance, Sale was a 50-year-old drifter, one who had been a sage for 8 years with no hope of becoming an ascendant. However, he had grown tremendously even as a sage. He had discovered countless ways to harness his talent abilities and even unlocked 3 levels of his heritage, which explained the wind platform beneath his feet. Sale had faced and weathered many horrors, but never had he encountered a moving darkness that couldn't be attacked. All they could do was brace for its assault and somehow hope they survived until daylight. That was the strategy the headmaster and others had devised, at least. But with his experience as a drifter, the one thing he could always sense was that things rarely unfolded as expected. Monsters' rifts. They were shrewd and wicked things that shouldn't roam the world as they pleased. More monsters flew out of the darkness, but they were nothing as threatening as the devilish maelstrom he had just slain. He exhaled and struck the string of his bow gently. Arrows of light began to dance around him, striking different flying monsters with devastating force. The drifters on the wall also regained their resolve. With Lyra and Nova on the ground, the wall became even more functional, supporting him from below with terrifying vigor. Nova's bombs resounded from time to time, making the wall tremble. And for the next hour they continued their ferocious and stalwart defense of the city, until the shadow storm began moving again. Chapter 1039. Divide and Conquer. Beneath the storm-ravaged sky stood a hill, or what appeared to be one. As one drew closer, the illusion crumbled. It was an obsidian monolithic structure veined with black twisting cables that anchored it to towering spires across the ground. The structure was colossal, nearly 20 feet long, dwarfing every other edifice around it. An old woman stood at the tower's balcony. She leaned heavily on a black cane and wore a dark ensemble that seemed like liquid shadow cascading down her body. Her face was ghostly pale, her hair beyond white and gossamer fragile. She stirred slightly and turned toward the room beyond the balcony. Her cane trembled, her shoulders too. Then the cane clattered from her grasp and she slowly lowered herself toward the ground. However, a strong pale hand caught her. "Canny, you shouldn't do that. You are far older than I am." The lady trembled. Her hand shook as she touched and felt the hand that held her scaling slowly toward his face, exploring his features. Lord Ruffsburg, you are so young again. Did something happen? You seem to have achieved your goal. Yet you appear so unwell. Why? Did it come at a greater cost than you anticipated? Ruffsburg chuckled. Stars Akani, you worry too much. He groaned and strained as he tried to move away from her. Despite being nearly blind from old age, the woman noticed and frowned. Lord Ruffsburg, you are barely alive. What happened? I've never felt you this weak. Ruffsburg chuckled but groaned silently again. He said playfully, perhaps my age is finally catching up with me? Akani's frown deepened. This is not the time for jokes, my lord. Ruffsburg's face lost its humor in that moment. He became stern. Then he sighed. Kenny. His voice sounded different, and the old lady raised her head, worry etched across her features. My lord. Ruffsburg was clutching his belly. Half his body from head to toe bore a strange and sickening discoloration, as though he had been grievously poisoned. His voice shook. I felt fear today. Kenny trembled. She frowned, looking at him, even though her eyes remained closed. My lord. There are not many things that can make you feel fear. Yet you fear so many great things, my lord. I am afraid your statement only baffles me. Ruffsburg sighed with a small smile. Your opinion of me is as lofty as it was 200 years ago. I wonder how you managed to believe in me so completely? Kenny smiled. You are the greatest being to exist. You are the world's exemplar. You accepted me when the world rejected me. You care deeply about our world in a way none other does. If that is not the makings of a god, I do not know what is. Ruffsburg frowned. Kenny. She lowered her head slightly in apology. I'm sorry, my lord. It slipped. Ruffsburg sighed and turned away from her. I almost died today. That's what I meant. I feared that for once in my life I might truly perish. And I fled. He exhaled and walked inside. Come now, Akani. Come and tend to my wounds. Akani stared at him with so much worry as she followed him. He sat down on a long rockabby chair, letting the old lady bend down and examine the discoloration on his hands. She frowned. Your body is strained. Your cells, they barely survived extinction from trying so much to exist to replicate and heal. I've never seen or head of the human body reach its limit, and certainly not that of someone like you. Ruffsburg closed his eyes and breathed steadily. He pursed his lips. That wretch. Akani continued to observe, and her brows only furrowed more and more. I'm sorry, my lord. But who did this? There is only one person capable of killing you in this continent. And I don't such person has any reason to. Ruffsburg exhaled. Well, there are two now. Of all 3 continents in Ultrail, the Central Plains is the most populated, blossoming with 2.7 billion people. The Central Plains had 25 nations in general, including the Empire. The Empire is the superhouse of power of the continent because of their rich history as the first nation to exist in the continent, in fact in the world, as far as the Age of Drifters was concerned. Of course, this did not mean the Empire alone was the only powerhouse. There were also other alliances that had been formed to balance the power of the Reamguard Empire, and the government in general had been created to balance the power of the nations. While clans in and of themselves exist to produce variables that no one can predict. The 25 nations could simply be divided into 6 categories. The Empire itself as the first category. The second category could be called Imperial Client States. These are puppets, kingdoms, tributaries, and colonies dependent on the Empire, and consist of 6 nations. The third categories were the rival powers, the Old Tower Alliance. These are 4 nations that have come together to form an alliance strong enough to resist imperial control. The fourth are the neutral states, economically and geographically insulated countries. They also avoid picking sides. The free cities are the 5th categories, which we can simply call the government, a fragile coalition of 3 independent small nations. And the remaining nations, whom could be considered wildcards that add to the presence of variables, and have grown to be neglected because at some point the prestigious clans that existed from the beginning joined them. Take the Kageyama clan, for example. They are in control of several cities and referred to as a nation at times, but do not call themselves anything asides the Kageyama clan. The central continent was a vast powerhouse itself, and yet this powerhouse was thrown into utter chaos, such that not even a neighboring country realized that its ally is under attack. Every nation was being secluded and destroyed at the same time, and standing above this plan was a mastermind that was neither a tyrant nor a drifter. He was only an ordinary human. If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.